Good afternoon or good morning to those of you joining us from a different time zone. My name is Sarah McChesney and I'm with ProTech Training. We would like to thank you for joining us today as we explore how to create user-friendly web-based forms. Today's presentation should be finished by 30 minutes after the hour. We welcome you to send us any questions during the presentation and our expert will be happy to answer them at the end. You will find the question area in the top right-hand corner of your screen within the control panel. But for now, please let me introduce you to today's presenter. Kay Corey Aubrey has over 25 years as a user experience researcher. She helps her clients understand their end users' needs and goals so that they can design better products. Kay specializes in usability testing and face-to-face ethnographic consumer research. In addition to providing qualitative research, Kay trains teams in usability testing, UX research, and user interface design. She is an editor, a trainer, and a REVA certified master focus group moderator. Without further ado, I introduce you to Kay Corey Aubrey.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a wonderful introduction. And thanks to everybody who's joining us today and folks who are listening in later on. What I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to go at a pretty fast clip because we only have 30 minutes, is I'm going to be giving you some tips for how to create usable web forms. And here's what we're going to be covering. The best way to show people how to design something is to show you examples of bad design that you've probably come across and then explain why that design doesn't work. So I'm also going to be telling you next about qualities of well-designed forms. Then we're going to switch the topic to some 4 key tips. Now this is not everything you need to know, but these are probably the 4 most important things that you should keep in mind to be able to design usable forms, especially online. We're going to talk about designing the form to match the user's task flow. Then we'll talk about designing the form so that it's easy to read online, and there are certain things that you need to know to be able to do that. And one kind of design tip that's fairly easy for laymen who have no experience with user experience to understand are the Justall principles or Justall principles. And then finally, I'm going to be talking about another bit of skill that you want to incorporate to create really good forms, and that's designing on a grid. A grid is something that graphic designers use a lot, and I just want to make you aware of it. So let's get underway. I'm going to start by talking about examples of bad form design. So here are some examples here, and these are old-fashioned dialog boxes. These are from a great book by Mullet and Sano called Designing Visual Interfaces. And in my mind, this is one of the books that I learned from in the mid-90s, but it still applies today. And they were generous enough to let me use examples from their book to explain what is bad design. So the first is there's no discernible pattern. And you're looking at dialog boxes here, but the same principles apply to a form. It's hard to make sense of this display at a glance. And there's a number of sort of kind of typical reasons for this. All of the elements on the screen have the same level of what we call visual priority. You don't know where to look first. You're looking at this start button because that's the strongest element on the page. But that's really not going to help you decipher the information on this particular dialog box so that you know what to do. Another kind of characteristic of bad form design that's very related is that the elements lack contrast. Again, it's that theme of everything being on the same plane visually, and there's no effort to guide the user's eye, to like where to get started. What is this page about? What are the sections in the page? Because as you know, as consumers of web content, we need to know in a millisecond if we're looking at the right thing. Another example of this is this here. This here, it's like these are all very pretty little pictures here, maybe circa 2000, but again, you don't know where to look. You don't really, the designer's not giving you enough information to help you make sense of what you're looking at and how you should interact with this particular display. Another issue that you see a lot is fields are placed haphazardly everywhere on the page, willy-nilly. Now, granted, all these fields fit nicely into this space here, but you know, there really is no order, and the visual order is kind of like a language that you're giving the user to help them absorb what they're looking at, and again, know where to start and how to make sense of what they're looking at. Another, another example here is, you have neatly organized forms, but they're very difficult to decipher. Now, here's an example of where the user task is a little bit complex. It's creating a schedule, but by looking at this display here, would you know how to attack that particular task? And I'm going to be talking about, methods for being able to organize the fields on a form so that you basically guide the user through. Another issue here is just cramming too much on a page. Now, hopefully you're seeing that a lot of what I'm showing you here is really common sense, and that's kind of the whole point of what I'm trying to show you. Another aspect of display that you need to learn how to work with is white space. And so this here has too much white space. So let's take a moment and look at qualities of well-designed forms. So first of all, what you do is you need to design the form to match the user's task flow. And this is the user research aspect of designing usable forms. You have to basically sit down with users whose process you're trying to automate and just watch how they do the task in the analog world. And those insights are going to really guide you at the highest level, at the most effective level, towards usable forms. Now, you should always think of a form in terms of a conversation. So you're presenting stimuli to an end user, they make sense of it, they respond. As the designer and the technology producer, you're giving them feedback that they need to kind of let them know, yep, you did the right thing, or no, you did the wrong thing, this is how you fix the problem. And you just basically, as a designer, you're taking that person by the hand and you are guiding them through the task. Now, as you watch people do a task, what you want to do is have them talk out loud. And you want to learn their language, their terminology, their mental model of the process that you are trying to automate. In user experience land, that is called the mental model. You start with a very clear and accurate understanding of the user's frame of mind, how they understand this task and what steps they expect to follow, because that's how you make an interface self-service. Now, here's an example of how you do a task analysis, and what I'm using here is a very simple process that most of us have probably done in the real world. So with a task analysis, what you're doing is you're basically mapping out, it's like a flow chart, you're mapping out all the different steps that user follows towards completing their goal. In this case, changing the ink cartridge on their printer. So step number one might be something like locate the cartridge to be replaced. Were they able to do that? Okay, so when you find where the cartridges are placed, you unsnap the old cartridge. If that works out, you snap in the new cartridge, and then you test the printer. And basically you iterate if any of these steps here is incomplete, or the person's not on course. So with a task analysis, and this is a very simple example, with a task analysis, what you're trying to do is really get a sense of these small steps, the micro steps that users typically follow to complete the task. And you're going to make this the backbone of your form. The next thing you might do is you might take that knowledge and just do a little layout, and it doesn't have to be anything fancy. You could just take a Microsoft Word document, or if you know how to draw and print nicely, you could just take a piece of paper and lay it out with the forms, and maybe have those sections, have sections of the form that correlate with how users think about that task. What are the categories of information that they're dealing with? And then you simply lay out the fields on this piece of paper, and you take into account that people read from top to bottom, left to right in our culture. So that's the way you're going to be doing the layout. And then you just basically take this draft and you present it to the users who are going to be using your form, and try to get a nice variety of people so that you get different types of feedback. And then you're just going to kind of follow, like maybe a design thinking approach where you present, and I'm calling that little piece of paper a prototype in this case. You prototype and test and prototype and test and prototype and test until you get it right. And the key thing is that you've done your homework, you know the task, you've encoded it in this prototype, and you're testing it with users in different situations. So, maybe they're registering for something, but what are kind of like the variations on the theme? Well, you want to capture those, and you've probably captured them in your early research. Now, let me expand a little bit on this slide here. Okay, so this is, you may have heard this term, it's kind of a big buzzword in UX land. It's called design thinking, comes from IDEO in the early 2000s. And this is their process, and it also parallels the user experience research process. You empathize, you take, and empathizing would be going out to your users, learning about them, in this case, learning about the task, learning all the different kinds of users who perform this task. You learn about the variations on the theme, the different ways that this task could be carried out, the different contexts in which it's carried out. And then you just basically take all that research, share it with your teammates, and then you start identifying the requirements. And those requirements typically align with the business model, or the reason why you're creating this form. And then what you're going to do is, kind of ideate and encode your ideas into some sort of prototype. And the watchword is always test early and often, and start this prototype testing cycle before you've spent money on implementation. That's really, really important. And I cover the skill sets involved in all of these processes here in my UX classes for ProTech. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the other thing, so we've talked about task analysis so far and how you take the results from that and use that as kind of the initial foundation for creating the form. Next consideration when you're designing forms for online, you have to understand how people read online. So that's what this section deals with here. First thing to know about how people read online is that they don't read, they scan. That's why it's super important for you to have that kind of like shell there to present people with, so that they can look at that form and in an instant, say, yep, this is what I need, and these are the categories of information that I need to fill in. So typically, this is eye tracking information here, and this is just, kind of characteristic of how people process information online. Where their eyes go, bing, 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 bing. And it's very predictable, and the more skilled you get at designing forms, the more you can control where people look, because that's really your job as the designer. Typically, people follow an F-shaped reading pattern where your eyes will go like this. Okay, and there's lots of really good references in these slides, which Sarah and her team are going to make available to you. This particular slide here is from a website called usability.gov, which is fantastic. And they go into how to do a task analysis, all the different skills involved. So this particular eye tracking result here is from usability.gov, and it shows you that kind of characteristic F-shaped pattern. Now, when you're looking at a form, our eyes will focus on where to enter the data, and they look on the left-hand side. So this shows you, it's kind of proof positive of how, to kind of guide you in terms of what you need to present folks in order for them to be able to process that form online. So notice that the eyes dance along the left-hand corner, and then everybody spends considerable time on the submit button, whatever that happens to, say. And so that's why it's also very important to make sure it's really clear where these buttons are on the form. Now, here's some of what I've talked about that you can read. You want to be able to present people with a structure, a visual structure that guides the eye, that matches their mental model of that particular task. And you do that with headers, subheaders, sub-subheaders, all the different sections within a form. And I'll show you some examples in a moment. Now, as I talked about, as the designer, you're like a movie director. So you're really directing people's attention, and you need to give that user what they expect in order for your online form to be successful. It's as simple as that. So some of the hallmarks of well-designed forms is people don't have to think. It's like, it's like pre-conscious reaction to the form. They just know what to do. They're able to go ahead and do their work quickly and efficiently without frustration and get their task accomplished. And a lot of this stuff we've already talked about. Another thing that we haven't talked about is in your task analysis, you need to make sure you understand the sequence in which people enter their data, and you want to match that in the form. You don't want people to have to jump all over the screen to do the data entry. Page needs to have a strong focus, and you're, as I've been trying to emphasize, you're really deliberately directing people's attention from the get-go. And the screen is self-contained. There's nothing else that the person needs in order to be able to complete their task. And very importantly, you know where you are within the process. Now, there's also this sense of flow, and flow goes along with forms that are well designed, where the designers actually did their homework. Let me show you some examples here. So this is from the Ohio State Lottery. And, you can see, some people may not like the color choices, but you can see as you look at this form, where do your eyes go? Do you know what this form is about? Would you know how to complete the form? Is there anything on this form that's confusing to you in order to be, if you wanted to contact the lottery? Why does it work? And a lot of times you can teach yourself these paradigms because we're all kind of, whether you know it or not, very experienced users because we've been using the web for, 15 years. So there's conventions out there that are well established. So you don't want to throw people curveballs. You want to keep, stay very tight to the wire in terms of any of the interaction patterns that you're presenting people. Just give them something that they don't have to stop and think about, or that confuses them, or makes them feel, wonder if they did the right thing. It's best to be very conventional and frankly not imaginative in how you're laying out those controls. On a well-designed form, it's easy to do complex things. So one of the features of this particular form here that I want to point out is you know where you are in the process because you have this guide up here that's telling you. So, and you know where you need to click. So everything is all very well presented. Now, and this is just kind of echoing a lot of what I've been telling you. Now, the information flow aligns with the task, and so sometimes it makes sense to break things down into smaller steps so that the person's not overwhelmed and each screen deals with just one thing. That's oftentimes a really good strategy. Now I'm going to talk a little bit, and I'm going very fast, but you can go back and listen to this and look at the slides to absorb. But the other tip would be to leverage Justall principles. And the Justall principles, these were designed in the 1930s in Germany. And basically, and this picture here is from another great book called Designing Interfaces by Jennifer Tidwell. With Justall, there are certain principles where things that are grouped together, our mind kind of creates the narrative. So in this case here, it's by proximity. You would know looking here that these groupings here are related somehow. You would know here because there's similarity, brown versus this aqua color. And then, you know, continuity and closure. So these are just basic Gestalt principles. Designers use them heavily in any kind of form design. Now, if you look at well-designed pages like Yelp, you can kind of analyze how they leverage Gestalt principles by using things like color, using things like, you know, shapes that are repeated. So these are what we mean by repeating patterns, and also just the way information is presented. You know that this is a title of a restaurant, that these are ratings, that this is a description. And you can present an awful lot of information in a small space just by leveraging these Gestalt principles. And here's another example for Fidelity.com. This is a tremendous amount of information, but it's all understandable and absorbable because the designers leverage Gestalt principles. Now, here's a challenge for you later on. Look at this form and kind of apply some of these principles that you're learning here to improve the design of this form that's very, very long and tedious. Now, finally, tip number 4, design on a grid. So grids are used by graphic designers, and it's nothing more than an underlying table where you place form elements. And what the grid does is it just gives you that sense of order, visual organization, proportion, and frankly, kind of a professional look to your forms. So definitely lay them out on a grid. Grids also help you deal with white space in a more effective way. Now here's an example of before and after using a grid. And you can really see how effective just that one thing about, you know, laying things out on a grid gives you a much more professional, much more absorbable and workable result. Here's some more examples as well that you can look at, and this is you know, just giving you some further proof of the value of using a grid. Now, if you want more information on grids, there's this great YouTube video called Grids Are Good, and here is the bit.ly to it, and it just kind of takes you through what a grid is and all the different uses of grids on, say, you know, whether you're dealing with paper layout or online layout. The principles apply both ways. Now, in summary, here is what we've talked about in this very quick webinar. Well-designed web-based forms match the user's task flow. They take into consideration how people read online. They leverage Gestalt principles, and they have fields that are laid out on a grid. So hope that this short webinar here is added to your toolkit and helps you to design more user-friendly online forms. Now, please, we're ready for questions. Here's a little bit about me. And on the next slide, I am going to show you some of my ProTech classes that are coming up. And I'm also available for custom classes at your organization. Yes. So, Sarah, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do, and thank you, Kay. And if you don't mind holding up that screen with the classes, that would be fabulous. Just a reminder, as per Kay's mention earlier, that we will be sending out her slide deck as well as today's recording, and that will be coming out later this week. I did want to mention as well that we do have a few upcoming courses that are on the screen, and Kay will be teaching all of those courses as she mentioned. In addition to these courses, we do offer routine free monthly webinars on a variety of different topics. And we are currently finalizing our list of upcoming webinars that will see us through the spring and summer into the fall months. So I invite you to visit the resource section on our website at www.protecttraining.com. And if you go there in the coming weeks, you'll see what's around the corner, as well as be able to review past webinar recordings and articles. Now on to the questions. The first question is, how do you approach form design if your users are very diverse in terms of their educational background and how familiar they are with the topic?
Okay, that's a great question. Well, that's part of that kind of empathizing phase in the design thinking approach, or what UX folks call the discovery phase, formative research. You need to get a good sense of who are the most important users. So you might have, for example, you might be a government agency and you need to design, say, tax forms that anyone can read. And that's hugely challenging because you have such a variety of users that you need to tend to. So the early phases of your before you actually do the work, you need to go out and identify who are these target populations that I need to cater to. And you basically go and sit with those people and watch them do that task. So you might have somebody, for example, who's an immigrant who doesn't speak English very well in one group. You may have, you know, a college-educated person as another group. And I'm calling these groups, they're really, the term is persona in user experience. So you have another persona who's maybe college educated, professional, reads at a, you know, 12th grade or, you know, college level, can handle terminology and complexity. You might have another person who reads, who's, you know, native English speaking, but they read at a 4th grade level. And I've actually worked on designs like this, and this is tremendously challenging. So what you do is A, identify these personas, and then B, adjust the concepts that you're presenting these people to the ones that are the most challenging. So you basically design for the people who would typically have the most trouble with that particular task. And if you do that, then everybody else hopefully will understand. So that would imply like writing at a, you know, maybe 4th grade level using very, very simple language, having very simple concepts that you're presenting people. This is where the skill comes in, but also at the other end, this is where you're able to create online forms that are truly self-service.
Great. Thank you for that. The next question we have is, what are some ways to handle error messages?
Oh, okay. Well, when you have an error message, you really, first of all, need to visually pinpoint where the error is. So you might have a form that's, you know, kind of like the basic colors you're using are gray and maybe a light orange or something. You'd want to have error messages highlighted to draw the person's attention to the field where the error is. Maybe you could use black. You want to use a contrasting color that draws the eye. You might also have another pattern where the field where the error is gets like a double line, double weight line to it. And then right underneath that field, you say what the error is and how to fix it. So that's kind of a simple way of doing it, and it's best to have this presented to the user at the time that they do the data entry versus at the time they do the submit button. There's also one other thing kind of related, I realize we're getting a little short on time, but kind of related is you give people formats. So you have to sort of lead the user so that you're not leading them down the primrose path. So you're telling them basically what kind of input is required. So if you have, say, dates, you might have in the next to the label the format of the date that the person should enter the data in.
That's very helpful. I guess any way that you can streamline and simplify and make it less work for the user sounds like that's the optimal way to go.
Yeah.
The third and final question that I have, and so if there's anyone that would like to still enter a question, there's still time for that. But the third question I have is, how do you design a form so that it works on both mobile devices and the desktop?
Ah, okay. Well, you know, a lot of the packages that you design online forms with have like liquid layouts. They're what they call responsive. So they might automatically adjust to mobile versus desktop. But sometimes you actually need to design different forms for those two different layout situations. So, you know, it really depends on the tool that you're working with, basically. You know, the general rule, though, is that when you're dealing with mobile, you want the person to have minimum necessity to do any kind of data entry. So you want to set up your form so that people can select and then push buttons. You don't want them having to go to the keyboard to enter data, because for most people, that's very tedious.
Absolutely. Makes total sense.
Uh-huh.
So, Kay, that's it for the questions for today. So first off, thank you very much, Kay, for your presentation and taking the time to speak to us today. And thank you to everybody out there who's taken time out of your lunch hour or morning hour if you're on the West Coast. Thank you for joining us, and we will be sending out the recording and slide deck as mentioned. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.